Hi guys, the purpose of this recording is just to talk through the story that we listened to in our Class Connect session today and apply some of those narrative techniques that we talked about during our CC to this story specifically. So towards the end of our CC today, we listened to the short story from your lesson today titled After 20 Years by O. Henry. So let's break this story down a little bit. We filled in the plot diagram during our Class Connect time today. So we'll look at, you can look at a filled in version of this in our CC recording. But for this recording, I want to break it down a little bit textually. So when we talk about the exposition of this story, this is where we are exposed or introduced to our characters and our setting. So the characters we see at the beginning of the story are the policeman, and the author tells us that the policeman is impressive, but he's not showing off. So we kind of get the impression that he's just kind of a typical street cop. He's not overly boisterous in his personality, but that he's good at his job and he does what he needs to do. Then we see the man in the doorway. And this character we don't learn much about, except that he's hanging around this deserted store at night. So immediately there are a lot of question marks around the man in the doorway as far as who he is and what he's doing. The setting is cold, dark, nighttime. The streets are empty, kind of this deserted storefront in the middle of the city. And our complicating incident happens when Bob says, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of a man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plainclothes man to do the job. So our complicating incident is when the policeman recognizes Silky Bob, and this is what sets the action into motion. However, this story is different because the reader only finds out that this was the inciting incident at the end of the story. Jimmy couldn't bring himself to arrest Bob, so the reader doesn't even realize that there is a conflict until we see this note at the very end of the story. So the whole story is suspenseful in one kind of way, and then we get that surprise ending and we realize that there was a whole other level of suspense and a whole other conflict going on that we weren't even aware about. Foreshadowing. Here's an example of foreshadowing that O. Henry uses in the story. It says, well, yes, for a time we corresponded, said the other, but after a year or two we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around over it, pretty lively. But I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive, for he always was the truest, staunchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. He was a kind of plodder, though, good fellow as he was. I've had to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. So how does O. Henry use foreshadowing in this passage? And again, this is something we don't realize until the end, but Bob is foreshadowing what's going to happen. He says, I know Jimmy will be here if he's alive, because he's a man of his word. He always keeps to his truth. So the foreshadowing here, of course, is that Jimmy does in fact show up. Jimmy recognizes Bob right away. And sets the action into motion without the reader even realizing it until the end of the story. The waiting man provides details about himself that foreshadow the revelation that he is, in fact, Silky Bob, the gangster from Chicago. He had to be a sharp-witted hustler to get his money, and he now wears diamonds and has his fancy watch. We're only able to identify this, though, upon a second reading after we've read through the story and we know the ending. We can't predict this on our initial reading because we don't know who this guy is. However, once we get to the end of the story and we find out who's who, Then we can go back and identify these details that are actually bits of information that we miss or that we don't realize are there upon our first reading. One of the best things about this story is the surprise. So O. Henry includes all the elements of the narrative arc, but he includes some information and hides other information in order to surprise the reader. So how does he craft this surprise? He does it in a very interesting way with this story because, again, like we said earlier, we don't realize that there's a conflict until the end of the story. The conflict, the inciting incident, and the conflict has happened in front of our eyes, and we don't even know it until we get to the end and we realize that Jimmy recognized Bob, that he's been in this conflict with himself on uh, how to pursue the situation. He doesn't want to have to be the one to arrest his friend, so he calls in another officer. All of this happens without us knowing until we get to the very end, and it's definitely an ending that we just don't see coming. The author includes details about how it's a dark evening, so neither character can immediately recognize the other. This is important as the story progresses. If it was broad daylight, both characters probably would have recognized each other right away, and the story wouldn't have been able to progress the way it did. The author withholds the information that the first police officer in the story is actually Jimmy Wells, the friend that Bob is waiting for. We don't know that until we get to the end. The author does not tell the reader that the man waiting in the doorway is actually the notorious criminal named Silky Bob. So the effect that this has is that the true identities of both men are withheld to heighten that first time reader's uncertainty and create that surprise ending. So there's quite a bit of irony here in this story. So I want you to take a couple of minutes and just reflect. What irony do we see in After 20 Years? Some of the irony that we see is that Bob hasn't been in New York for 20 years. And what's especially ironic about O. Henry's story is that in fleeing the law in Chicago, Bob actually runs straight into the arms of the law in New York, to a city he hasn't been in for 20 years. And he's trying to run away from being arrested in Chicago and actually runs straight into the arms of his friend, Jimmy Wells, who is a police officer in New York. He is literally walking arm in arm with a policeman when he learns that he's under arrest. Bob doesn't brag about his misdeeds to the uninformed cop because that would obviously be foolish. But once he thinks he's reunited with his old friend Jimmy, he starts confiding about how he has made his fortune. So this was an activity we were going to complete in our class connect time that we didn't have time to get to. If you want to complete it, you can go to goformative.com/join and you will enter the code 2R66G8. And I'm just asking you to answer one of those three questions that are there, and then you can do the bonus question if you have time. Here was part of the information we filled out from the narrative arc. The main characters, of course, are the police officer, Jimmy Wells, and the man in the doorway, Silky Bob. The inciting incident is when Bob meets the police officer, although he doesn't know the officer is his old friend, Jimmy Wells, and we don't know that as a reader until we get to the end. The third person omniscient is the point of view we're given. And we have several different conflicts here. We have man versus man. We also have man versus self, I think, with Jimmy and his apprehension to arrest his friend. Okay. The last thing I want you to think about as you're finishing up this recording is reflect on today's learning objective. And we don't have voting tools because you're just watching this on a recording, but I want you to just reflect, do some self-reflection. And the statement says, I can analyze the narrative arc, foreshadowing, and how the author creates surprise in the story after 20 years. Is this something that you still don't understand as it pertains to this specific story, but you're trying? Do you understand some of it, but need some clarification? You understand most of it, but you need to review, or you understand this very well and you could even explain it to others. So just take a couple of minutes to do some self-reflection. How do you feel about that narrative arc and how you can apply it specifically to the story after 20 years? How do you feel about foreshadowing and the author's ability to create surprise in after 20 years? Is that something that you feel confident in identifying and explaining, or is it something that we need some more work on? So just reflect to yourself on that. We will continue to revisit these items and these topics throughout Unit 2 and applying them to other stories, and then even applying them to our own writing when you begin writing your own personal narrative. So thank you guys for watching this. I hope this was helpful in breaking down the story for you and helping you better understand after 20 years.